Can you say things to me this time? Or is it still broken? Oh, I can see things now. Yes, I can see Gemma, I can see Luke. Who else have we got? I'm assuming Eden, if Eden's the one who's emailed me. So who's my fourth, fifth, and sixth who were there before? Back up to four again now. Five. Who else? Who else have we got here, people? Who? Now that I can actually see you talking, it keeps going up between different numbers. Molly can't watch. She's watching her brothers. Laura's there. Right, okay. As it's sort of a bit late starting, let's have a go and kind of try and go through some kind of relevanty bits. Okay, sorry, I'm just checking the email at the same time. So I gave you one kind of article that was similar to what you've had before this time, and then I gave you the kind of the short film that goes with it as well, for the Doll's House. We'll start off, just have a quick chat about the short film. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't use this in various different ways to talk about kind of critical interpretations. I know it's not a direct critic, but it is a kind of form of adaptation. It does point out various things about the kind of the text in its original form as well. So you've all watched the little film. Did all of you read the article as well? The article, I think, was possibly a harder article than some of the other articles I've given you to read. Did you find it more difficult? Did you read it or not? Jay is here as well. Did you read the article, Jay? I'm guessing not, as I won't have sent it out to you, but never mind. Go on, people. Did you read the article as well, or am I just talking about the little film clip? As I say, this is the last one I'm doing for you lot, because you would have had your exam by this point. Would have been all over. I'm not convinced the chat is working again at the moment. I can see some. You've read bits of article, maybe the bits on the crib sheets. Hey, you can stay if you want, Jay. I'm just not sure how engaging it'll be if you haven't watched the film clip and read the article. Okay, so I'm going to pose you some questions around about the kind of film clip quickly and kind of work it in. I think maybe the ending of the film clip is the bit that you would find easiest to work into a kind of response. So it's the kind of modern version of A Doll's House. How did you find it? Do you think it was different to the original, or do you think it's the same? What kind of similarities and differences were there that you kind of thought between the modern Nora and the kind of historical Nora that you get in the original Doll's House? Go on, talk to me, people. What did you kind of think in terms of the film, in terms of similarities and differences? Yeah. So it does suggest some kind of progression. We have modern Nora who's got a job. What kind of limiting factors does it imply within her kind of job role? How is her position within that job role different from kind of Ibsen's Nora? What kind of barriers did she still have? Yeah, so you've got the mutual disregard for the children at the end. How many of you found the kind of modern version more disturbing at the end where she leaves the children than the kind of um, the Ibsen version? I know I found it more disturbing when she left them at the end, but maybe you can give me reasons why. Why do you find it kind of, or why might you find it more disturbing at that end point? Okay, so Gemma finds it more disturbing in terms of the way that the gender roles are still present. They're still just as kind of present as they were kind of 100 years previously. Did she abandon them for entirely selfish reasons? What's the difference between Nora abandoning the children there and the woman in the contemporary film abandoning them as well? What did Ibsen's Nora leave them with that the contemporary one doesn't leave them with? Yeah, the nanny. So that's the bit that I kind of found more disturbing. That they're properly abandoned. Those little children left on the trampoline with absolutely nothing there, as opposed to Nora in the original doesn't leave them kind of completely alone. They're still in a house with Torvald there. Yeah, that's a good point as well. So in the original, we don't see the children directly on stage at this point. So their abandonment becomes kind of less evocative because they're not there and present and kind of influencing us in that way. Dun, dun, dun. What may the questions around that one? Hang on. Um, yeah, the other kind of thing, what's it suggesting about kind of women in appearances then? What's the expectation around women that isn't there for men within that version? Type in, people. I'll be back in a second. Oh. Oh. Sorry about that. Yeah, so there's the implication of the kind of the more modern children as sort of more attached to their mother than the historical ones. Yeah, and this modern Nora is she's working for people, and even in that world of work, she's kind of sacrificing her own identity in the kind of process. Yeah, so the men around her, they talk about the kind of their freedom and things. Their Yeah, the expectation of women as still being central within childcare, even though she's working, and the kind of the freedom of the men being depicted in talks about them kind of going golfing and networking on the golf course and things like this. Yeah, so there's almost a sense of mockery as well, a sense that she's almost taken on too much, maybe by working. So yeah, the idea of ridicule coming into it, I think, is kind of relevant as part of this as well. She is ridiculed for almost taking on too much. Yeah, so they're given a head start because they've got the freedom and leisure time that she doesn't have. So through that kind of leisure time, they've been allowed to kind of push ahead in this world of work where she hasn't. They haven't got that same kind of pressure on them. Last question I'll ask, and I haven't actually put it down on the sheet. Actually, I'm only kind of thinking of it now. So in the kind of in the Ibsen version of the play, Nora kind of leaves, and there's the implication that Nora kind of probably won't come back. Do you think the modern Nora is going to come back? Do you think that she is depicted in that modern adaptation as, potentially returning at some point? Yeah, so they've both got full time jobs, but there's the kind of difference in terms of kind of the expectations and yeah, there's that kind of condescending attitude, those kind of asking where, that kind of almost disbelief in relation to it that she's kind of coming through. Do go to my other question there before I kind of move on. Do we think that that modern Nora will return? Sorry, I'm just going to keep having to check over. I'm trying to set, or we have set up even a Microsoft Teams for all the first years now. So if you were still here rather than on this, it would be on Teams now. But there's not as much point setting it up for you at this stage. I didn't even notice she'd taken the doll with her. Um, Yeah, now thinking back to it, I can kind of imagine it in my mind's eye. So maybe she's returning. What kind of symbolic action or symbolism do you think there is in taking the doll with her? Why might she take the doll with her? Yeah, yeah, yeah. And interesting. She does seem to be severing ties, but she does have more to go back to. There's leaving the phone, leaving the keys, leaving the children, but there is more there. Yeah, and the idea of it kind of symbolizing herself within this. Okay, so let's just kind of pull out a few bits from that. If you ever were to sit down and do the exam, the way in which you would kind of work this in. Well, the kind of the way it heightens the kind of disturbance, the way it sees the ending as a kind of disturbing abandonment, can reflect back into the kind of original. It can be seen as a kind of critical view on that. Um, yeah, or potentially it's simply by accident the fact that she's kind of constantly reminded of this connection as well. You could look at kind of the way in which a modern audience would still be able to sympathise with the positioning of Nora, that this adaptation, this critical response shows that there hasn't been such a kind of sizable shift in terms of how it's kind of presented. That there's still these kind of problems going on within it. Any other thoughts in terms of the film, people, before we kind of think briefly about the kind of the Coleridge criticism? Okay, so there's definitely a sense that there has been progression since Nora's kind of time frame. I mean, she's not the doll's house itself, remember, never leaves the setting of the home. So at least here we do see Nora outside of the home. We see her in those wider settings. Okay, I'm going to move the discussion onto the Coleridge stuff briefly because I've got to do another meeting at 3 o'clock, and we managed to lose some time at the start with it not kind of working properly. More in that apt interpretation will be following Nora in her role as a trophy wife. So, go on, just to clarify that one for me, Eden. Do you see do you see her as a trophy wife in the adaptation as well, or do you think that she's maybe lost that status as a trophy in the kind of modern one? Do you think there's maybe something slightly more genuine there in that sense? Okay, so you think that she wasn't necessarily in that one, and that means that there's not the kind of direct comparison you can make because it's her status has changed. Possibly those are kind of challenge points on that. That's part of the purpose to show that women have developed into slightly more than simply the kind of trophy that they were before. Yeah, so yeah, an interesting point as well. There's that separation. So the Nora of Ibsen's one, she doesn't have that same pressure and stress. She has those things taken away from her. She's got the nursemaid. She doesn't have to work for a living. So she's actually going out to seek those things. Whereas it's almost the reverse that's kind of breaking down our modern Nora. Yeah, it's an interesting little film, that, I think. Yeah, it's amazing what happens when you do the work. And I think it's a good little film that makes you think. Right, anyway, the Coleridge stuff. So I do think that the Coleridge article, after I kind of went over it more fully, I think it was quite a difficult one to get your head round. Um, I think the main thing that he's kind of doing in that article is that he's saying that on the surface level, with the Coleridge poems and primarily with the Ancient Mariner, he's presenting this idea that um, it's supposedly a kind of religious sense of guilt that leads into this. What the author of the article is saying, that it's more something personal on Coleridge's part. It's more something that is around the kind of idea of his own desire to find a reason for something that actually has no reason. So it's all a kind of projected onto it, and there's not necessarily that there's a genuine sense of guilt that goes with it, linked to a specific action. That's a kind of misnomer in it. So there's a few different things that you could kind of do with that as a critical voice. Now, the first thing you can do is kind of challenge that idea that there's nothing of religious guilt about it. So Coleridge is, yes. So who was the critic who talked about the Christian self, Gemma? You could almost use one critic to challenge the other critic. What was his name? Plath. Yeah, Ted Hughes. So you could say that as opposed to I can't remember what this critic's guy's name is. Hang on, his name is dun, 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 Harry White. So where Harry White says that it's not actually got anything to do with this sense of religious guilt, for Ted Hughes, actually it's the opposite, and it is more Coleridge kind of seeking for his better kind of Christian self. Yeah. Yeah, same surname. I suddenly think that. Yeah. What about evidence from the poem itself? What kind of evidence heightens that sense that it is something religious? So the act of killing the albatross and the various other ones. So you think you're kind of disagreeing with this critic then, in the way that he's kind of discarding this and saying that the Christian bit is more a kind of something projected in afterwards. Can you think of any evidence from the poem where it links very directly to the kind of Christianity and that failure of the Christian self? I'm going to give you a minute to just type me in any bits around that. I'm just going to go and check what they're doing on the Teams thing. Dun, dun. Yeah. So what the kind of the critic here does kind of sidetrack some of the build up to the killing of the albatross. He kind of almost neglects to pay attention to the way that Coleridge builds up this Christian imagery around it and this Christian symbolism with it. So yeah, good. As Gemma points out, as if it had been a Christian soul we hailed in God's name. Instead of the cross, the albatross around my neck was hung. Yeah, Eden. So 100% that shows that he feels this kind of sense of guilt and self-loathing. The critic is not necessarily disputing the point that he feels guilty, but he's disputing the origin of that guilt. He's sort of saying that the origin of that guilt is not truly linked to anything religious. It's more simply a kind of something more unhinged almost. It's to do with his kind of mental instability as much as it is anything, a kind of single act, a single defiance in a kind of Christian sense. Okay, so we're definitely challenging it and saying that it is more religious rather than simply a reflection of Coleridge's kind of own mindset and his own kind of bleakness. Dun, 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 dun. I might skip around slightly in terms of the ordering here. Okay, no, maybe not. So it talks about the idea of kind of punishment coming into the poem. So what kind of evidence could you use to kind of show that this punishment comes from an external source rather than an internal source? Because the author here suggests that really what's going on more within the poem is it's all happening internally, it's all happening within the mind of the mariner rather than it being something kind of external to him here. So what do you think? Do you think you can make a case for that? Do you think he's being punished from something outside of himself, or is all this punishment happening within his mind? Is nothing actually outside happening? This is all just simply a projection. Yes, so you do have the reference to the kind of the spirit that plagued us. So yeah, and this is kind of a godly spirit. So you think, Gemma, that it is all in his mind and that maybe it's only internally that he's creating these images, that he's kind of in his deluded state that these are occurring? Trying to use the mouse on the wrong one. Yeah, so you're kind of focusing back in on the morality tale. You're saying that you do see it as a morality tale, whereas this kind of critic thinks it's more than that. That it's not simply meant as a a morality tale. Where's the next bit? Yeah, so this is what the critics pointing at. So you're kind of linking it into some of the kind of biographical elements, and yeah, there is a kind of feeling that it could be linked into Coleridge's own opium addiction and the kind of depression that stems from that. This is where the argument gets kind of convoluted. He's basically saying that in reality, all of this is based on his opium addiction and the depressions that go with it, whereas Coleridge kind of almost desperately wants it to be something more than that, to be an act of religious transgression rather than something just simply linked to a state of mental disturbance. Yeah. So you've got that kind of maybe more, you could almost argue a middle ground there with kind of Eden's point that maybe on a seeming conscious level, Coleridge intends it to be something of a morality tale, but that subconsciously he's reflecting actually something more personal than that, that it's something more kind of disrupted than that. If you're on fire, you should tip some water over you. See what I did there. Now, the next thing that he kind of goes on to say is the in a lot of the poems, and he kind of extends this beyond the simply the mariner, although the mariner is still central. He says that for Coleridge's point of view, a lot of his characters, or all of his characters, are simply weak, and that they could re-exert control over their own mind. So that if they wanted to, they could force a control back onto themselves. They're simply too weak. So, do you agree with that? Do you think that with a lot of these characters in his poems, they're simply weak, and if they wanted to, they could regain control? And just 2 seconds, guys. I'm just responding to something on this. Yeah, interesting. So for the maybe the peripheral characters like the crew, um, they can't exert any kind of control. They are having things done to them, They are like lifeless tools. Yes, good. Um, what about for the central characters though? So what about for the mariner himself? Is he kind of presented as if he wanted to, he could re-exert control? Yeah. So you've got the reference to nightmare, life in death, and the way that she kind of is placed in a control over the mariner's fate. So this could be a genuine external force controlling. It could not be to do with the weakness of the mariner's mind. Okay, he means he does mean more towards the central figure. So the crew would provide a nice point of contrast, but think around the mariner himself. Think about some of the other poems too, potentially. I thought about the lime tree bower for this one. So there's the attempt to kind of look to place to gain control. Yeah, Christabel, she, think about the way that Geraldine's depicted within that. She's depicted as kind of powerful outside force. So it's not necessarily to do with Christabel able to exert her control if she had the will to do so. I think there, Jeremy, you're mixing up Kubla Khan with the pains of sleep. So you're thinking about the man who comes and disrupts the vision of Xanadu in Kubla Khan. So yeah, there's for all the force of willpower, he can't take himself back to that place. Yeah, Coleridge can count. He's depicting, or the kind of critic here suggests that he's kind of depicting his own mentality through these characters. So yeah, you can talk around Coleridge here, and the ones where it's more directly him as well. So he himself is, it's not necessarily that he's weak-willed. There's a genuine physical impossibility of him kind of returning to this. Dun, 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 dun. Which were the my other points use other bits of evidence, but they're kind of similar questions here. Hang on, let's just see. Okay. Right, I'm just going to choose one more question, people, because I say I've got to join another meeting at 3 o'clock. Okay, let's try kind of centering around this one. I'll kind of pose this as a question. The author here of the kind of criticism, so Harry White here, sort of suggests that, and I'm taking some bits from the longer one as well. He talks about the fact that the narrative voice or the mariner himself never really seems to show any genuine sense of guilt for killing the birds. He does feel guilty around the kind of the crew more than the killing of the bird itself. So, what kind of evidence could you kind of suggest that um, shows that his guilt is more situated on the crew, their responses, that's really where it all comes from, rather than actually killing the bird? Or could you give evidence that actually it's the death of the albatross that he feels more guilty about? Where do you think the source of his guilt comes from, the crew or the actual act of killing? Which do you think, people, and what bits of evidence could you bring in that would potentially go with that? Yeah. So the crew, and it kind of heightens his relationship between them. He stands beside, it's the nephew. He said naught to me. So there's the focus on the crew in that response. Yes. And we get that kind of connection, the kind of the curse here, the curse in a dead man's eye. And remember his own eyes, the glittering of his own eyes connects him to the crew. Um, so potentially that sense of guilt is more linked to the actions and the loss of the crew than his killing of the birds. Yeah, and it's after the crew has kind of passed away that he looks up to heaven for kind of a response. So think about it. I'll leave this as a kind of a last thought for you. You started off by saying, and the kind of general consensus was that actually this is a religious tale in which the killing of the albatross is important as a religious one. But if you're now saying that he feels more guilt around the kind of the crew, and that comes kind of afterwards, and that's as part of it, does that reduce the religious implications? Does that take away from the killing of the albatross, which is the thing that's had all of the kind of religious implications built up around it? And actually, if it's guilt based on the crew, then it's not a religious guilt, it's a more personal guilt. Um, as I say, I've got to go and log on to this other meeting now, so I'll have to leave you with that as a kind of thought at this point, and a quick couple of closing bits. But have a think about that. That could almost contradict some of the arguments from earlier. Um, as I say, people, this is the last one I'm going to do like this because there's not many of you logging on to it at the moment. I will keep sending you out at least something to read every week. Just as I say, hopefully we've all submitted our grades now, and hopefully they'll come through and they'll be, they'll be fine. I would just keep reading around various bits, just so that on the off chance that you do have to sit the exam at the end of it, you're not suddenly thrown into a panic because it's been months and months and months and months, and since you looked at anything related to the courses. So it doesn't have to be kind of intense revision for weeks and weeks and weeks, but just make sure you're doing bits and bobs here and there that just keep it in the front of your minds. Yeah, and as I say, I'll keep trying to help. If you've got questions or worries, just email me as well, people, and I'll quite happily kind of answer questions. Or if you want me to look at anything, I will do. But yeah, for the moment, I'm going to kind of leave off on this. The other reason is the college is moving us all onto Teams, so anything that's done live will now be done through the kind of Microsoft system. So I'll still be making videos on here for the first years for some of the lessons, but a lot of it's moving on to kind of different platforms as well. So I don't want to kind of split across them. But anyway, I will speak to you all again. I will see you all again. So it's not bye-bye entirely, but it's off for the moment, people. So I shall speak to you all at some other point.